Prepare thine ears, prepare thine bum. For the Things We Think About podcast has come. Now for your hosts, Kenny and Aaron.
Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of Things We Think About. This is your host, Aaron, and we are once again sans Kenny. He is, I believe, moving into his bunker to prepare now for the fallout from the Area 51 raid. So yeah, he's planning when they inevitably come and lean back on him with all the governmental might that he can sustain his way of life. And I'm going to keep making that joke until something very tragic happens in the news regarding Area 51, and then it won't be funny, and then we'll think of another reason why Kenny's not here. So anywho, today we're talking about transhumanism, and you might be thinking, what the hell is transhumanism? It's a kind of an interesting word. When I first heard it, I immediately jumped to transgender, transsexual. Anytime you hear trans, usually it precludes one of those two adjectives. So yeah, we're going to get into what that means later on the show. Essentially, it ties in, though, to a lot of the interests that me and Kenny have in artificial intelligence and how technology is basically affecting every aspect of our lives. And transhumanism is essentially a philosophical framework, ethical framework on which we can view a lot of these things. So quick little housekeeping here. Just want to mention that the Ramshackle Brewing Company is now open. They're serving a lot of great brewskis, so go and check that out. That was episode 3 we did with Joe. Check that episode out if you're interested in kind of the genesis of Ramshackle Brewing Company and a little bit of the science behind how the beer is made. And I've been seeing some great things. They have a great Beer It Forward program where basically you can buy somebody a beer with the stipulation of, say, like, for example, being a veteran. And they put it on their board, and then a veteran comes in, and they take it, and they get a free beer. So it's really quite the socialist beer regime they have over there. I mean, not really, of course. Again, at the end of the day, they get the coin. So outside of that, it's just the usual shout outs to the Facebook page, the Reddit threads, all that other stuff. We've been seeing a lot of great traffic come in, and we just want to keep saying we appreciate your continued support of the show. So without further ado, I'm going to be talking with Frank today. He's somebody I found on the Our Transhumanism Reddit thread. He's been on several other podcasts. He's had an interest in transhumanism and everything tech for most of his life. And yeah, we had a pretty lively discussion over what exactly it is. So without further ado, here's Frank. Thanks for being on the show, and we're going to get into it today with a little transhumanistic or humanism or whatever the nomenclature is. So I'm got to confess, I'm very green on the whole subject as a whole. I was watching the HBO show Years and Years, and that word was brought up, and it immediately piqued my interest because I thought they said transgender or transsexual, which is what we usually hear, but transhumanism. I'm like, wait a minute, that's interesting to me.
Just for the record, I thought that joke, I thought it was like a little forced. I thought it was probably the one of the worst parts of that otherwise pretty fantastic show. But yeah, like you got to give you got to like get the normies in on it somehow, right?
Yeah. Which I definitely am at this point.
Yeah, so transhumanism is pretty old idea. If you read there's like people who have tried to piece its sort of lineage throughout history, and you can kind of find examples of it going back really to the very first recorded mythologies. I don't know, I think people cite the Epic of Gilgamesh, and also there's some really interesting stuff like people looking at ancient Greek legends and showing how there were things that today we would recognize as robots or stuff like that. I think the reason for that is so the popular association with transhumanism is usually it's tied, better or worse, because of people mainly get it through stuff like Hollywood, which has an incentive to tell really interesting, entertaining stories. It's associated with stuff like The Matrix or The Terminator, really flashy science fiction. I would say transhumanism is kind of the default state of being human. I think a really good example of this is that of fire. in the evolutionary record, I think we can like pinpoint the roughly when our species like started using fire on regularly, because you can see like our bodies changed. We started outsourcing tasks that would have been done by like our gut or our teeth in terms of like breaking down food and digesting it to fire. So through cooking, we no longer required certain biological features, and so gradually over time those disappeared. We can tell from the fossil record. There's some interesting theories about how cooking may have given us larger brains, but there's much less evidence for that because brain matter it isn't as well preserved. But I think really it's like part of being human. It is inseparable from technology. That's like how I really define transhuman. It's like really making explicit the fact that to be human is to use technology, and it's like it's impossible to separate ourselves from technology. It's like this recentering around okay, so this is the case, we should like critically engage with it, because it's like trite to say, but it's true. The world we live in, like the technological possibilities for both good and bad, are like obviously stark, and they're growing starker by the day. And that was explored in years and years. Like it's pretty easy to imagine like an anti-technological movement, like what happened in that show, like rising up. And in some ways it's justified. And I say this is like someone who's pretty pro-technology. Like, there are abuses that are happening. Like, I don't think that's inherent to the technology, but technology raises the stakes. I think like a perspective where we critically engage with this stuff and we don't just like let it evolve, quote unquote, like naturally, which of course it doesn't. Like there's, massive institutional forces shaping how things play out. Like, I think that's essential. And I think that's what transhumanism brings to those are the questions that like discourse promotes. And, there's like cool stuff where people talk about like the really futuristic cyborgs and like mind uploading or whatever. But I think that's beside the point. I wear glasses, and I think that's a perfect example of a transhumanist technology. And I think it's one that's, been incredibly successful. So yeah, like I'd really like to also kind of have the discourse also include like these things that we think is low tech, that glasses have served us for like thousands of years, and I think that suggests that they're very robust and they're very like useful. It's not like certain other forms of technology where there's a lot of hype and then they're over. Like nobody uses them in like a couple of years. I think that's another really interesting perspective. Anyway. Yeah,
it's funny you bring up glasses because we're already seeing obvious technological advances. I mean, we have, of course, LASIK's been around for 20, 25 plus years, and that's a supplement to our normal degrading vision. I think it's great that you point out the very obvious example of fire and its relation to, basically, it's almost like the first trans thing we've had as human. Just the basic definition of any human process that isn't done innately by us could be considered transhumanistic.
That's a really interesting point, because that's true. Like fire is sort of like this external thing to us we exist within a symbiotic relationship with. But like if you look at like the evolutionary record, like that's been happening since the beginning. Mitochondria, which is this essential part of like a cell's ability to produce energy, that was originally like just a bacteria that was swimming around, and then it got eaten by another bacteria, and then they entered into a symbiotic relationship with each other because like the energy produced by mitochondria was useful, and then the bigger bacteria could do things for it. So like the only difference between that and technology is that wasn't planned, and also technology happens at a much faster rate. There's like constantly symbiotic and like mutualistic relationships throughout nature. The only difference is we're more conscious of it, and we've got like this awareness of it and a meta awareness where we can go like one level up, and we can like start thinking about rearranging relationships and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the mitochondria example. I mean, that's an example of natural selection to a certain degree. And, you could argue whether there's any human touch to that other than to say that that's a process that happened in our evolution, in our biology. I've heard the argument made, too, that the only way basically to go forward now is through artificial selection. And I think to me, that's essentially why I'm so interested in transhumanism. And I know at other times in the show, we've talked about our interest in artificial intelligence and how that plays into everything, which I think, to me, AI could be a part of a transhumanist ethos, more just kind of within the philosophy. They're not separate from each other. I really like this idea, though, that there's a symbiosis between technology and us and that relationship. That's really, really what interests me as well. I'm wondering for your end, what kind of got you into this kind of stuff?
I've been aware of it for a while now. This might date me or it might not. I think I probably first came across it explicitly from the Joe Rogan podcast. That was just his milieu of sort of hippie LA people, which obviously is very close to Silicon Valley. It's this sort of thing comes up, but I didn't really take it all that seriously. But then I came down with chronic fatigue syndrome, which is a whole other thing, and I won't go into, very complicated. But basically, I think before I had chronic fatigue, I guess it was a lot easier to think of my body as this whole thing. And there was a very clear delineation between inside and outside. And then after chronic fatigue syndrome, because all these things went wrong and I had to individually fix them and play around with them. And I also learned a lot about biology and medicine because chronic fatigue syndrome isn't very well studied. And so I had to do my own research. I became just more aware of how it's, you can't really delineate yourself. There is something of a boundary there, but it's very porous and things can be changed. And I gained a lot more of an appreciation for just how complex and dynamic things are, and how in many ways the human form that we're given is quite arbitrary. I guess that made me more receptive. Yeah.
Gotcha. So if you don't mind, and I do want to respect your boundary on it for sure, so you don't feel like you have to answer, but could you help me understand what chronic fatigue syndrome is, maybe how it's defined, at least medically?
Yeah. So the really fun thing is, so syndrome is basically doctor speak for we have no idea what's going on.
Gotcha.
Chronic fatigue syndrome, it doesn't have any biomarkers just yet. There's some people working on it in terms of things that we can actually point to in the body. There is no formal definition yet. I think the diagnosis is 6 months or a year of fatigue, and there's no other explanations or something. It's I got my diagnosis years ago and I can't really remember what happened. But it's really, really complicated. I think one positive thing about it is I think that the research that's going on with chronic fatigue syndrome right now, it's going to have applications in so many other areas, especially in the domain of anti-aging, because it's a lot of the symptoms are they also show up in people who are suffering from the same problems that come with aging, if that makes sense. Yeah, and I think that's another reason why I became attracted to transhumanism, is because I'm in my mid-20s right now, and my early 20s were this weird period where I was living the life of someone 4 or 5 times my age, just because what I could do was so limited. And because I had all these problems, and thankfully I've gotten better. I'm still recovering, but I've made significant progress. But it's this really wild insight that I have, which I don't know, it's super cliche, but I am quite grateful for what I went through. Mostly because I got better.
Definitely doesn't hurt.
Yeah. There's all I think there's pretty good evidence showing that people who suffer traumatic experiences generally find them, when they look back in retrospect, if they survive, to be pretty uplifting, probably just as a basic psychological defense mechanism. I find it really insightful to have kind of had that experience, and in certain ways I'm very mature despite the fact I missed out on like years of my life because of this, which is super interesting. Anyway, yeah.
But it's great to hear that you found the silver lining to your situation. And I agree how frail things can be and how much for granted we take different processes in our body. I'm in relative health. I don't have any particular, even allergies to anything except maybe penicillin. So, but does that make me more, quote, human than somebody else who has maybe, some other type of accessibility issue or something like that? I'm not sure. But definitely I can see how that would spark an interest in the subject and just the general wanting to shed the skin, essentially, of humanity. And usually in this debate, it seems like there's, at least initially, so far I've studied, there's kind of the two camps, right? There's one that's saying, oh, well, let's keep the human things human. Let's not worry about all this stuff in the future. And the other camps, well, no, we need to race towards this stuff in the future because otherwise, what the hell are we doing?
There's this paper by this transhumanist philosopher, Nick Bostrom. It's called something like Astronomical Waste or something. And it's basically him making an argument for why like we should be devoting basically all of our resources towards first getting into space and then like colonizing basically all of space. And his argument is that I don't know, like every day or something, another like galaxy slips. There's this radius of like stuff in the universe that we can get to before it goes so far away that we'll never be able to reach it because of like light speed limitations. And he's like basically arguing like, if you value human life or consciousness or even something as banal as paper clips, well, then you want to get that stuff before it slips away. Otherwise it's like, will we just lost forever? And I don't take quite that perspective. I do think like, God, the energy that, our sun puts out every second and the amount of it that, just is just wasted in, it just like will go into space and the only thing it will ever do will maybe reach like eyes of like aliens millions or billions of years into the future. And, maybe like they'll see like a sparkling star or something and that'll be the only thing it'll do. You can make arguments about it, but like just the sheer amount of, energy that is going into nothing. I think it's like a really, it's difficult to wrap your head around, but once you do, you're like thrown back, like awed at the fact that we're just like wasting all this potential. And yeah, at the same time, like I think people who are more conservative about this, they do have a point. Yeah, obviously, it is incredibly trite to say, but let's say it again. New technology is dangerous and it is disruptive. And you can't just like wipe that away by saying like, oh, but it's gonna be great. Like there are like unintended consequences, and I have like lived with some of that. I'm sure part of my chronic fatigue was caused by like, I don't know, like stuff like overuse of antibiotics, and like maybe crappy nutrition because I was eating like fast food or like plants that didn't grow and didn't have the right amount of nutrition because of like the farming agricultural practices we use or something like that. It is, as like the science fiction writer Cory Doctorow says, it's like, like everything's going to be like a great and amazing if we don't like fuck it all up.
That seems obvious, but it's very true.
You want to make sure like everyone like is aware of the possibilities, because then you can make like more informed decisions.
Right.
This is a slight tangent, but I think in this day and age, like I think, there's a lot of concern about like crisis of meaning, like our civilization or whatever. And I think there's something to that, but I think a really like understated part of that is like, for example, if I was like working at something like SpaceX or something, like one of these companies or research labs or whatever that are like really like making this stuff happen, like I would wake up every day and I'd be like, man, like, you know, I could be like helping send like humanity to the stars. Like, that's fucking awesome. But I think the problem is like, yeah, like that's really great. But like, also once you realize it, you also like realize the potential for stuff to go wrong. And also like the consequences, even when they go right, are like, they're just so overwhelming that we don't have sort of the institutional like narratives even to like understand them. Like,
I definitely see that being an issue. And like you mentioned, you've seen a little bit of the externalities and the human cost of trying to advance technology in the name of technology or capital or capitalism, or, you know, however nefarious way we would want to frame it. And rightfully so, in a lot of cases, you know, there's not anything really that doesn't have some type of cost. But it's interesting, going back real quick to the idea that the universe is expanding, and then we're in a little bit of an arms race to kind of grab all these things, so to speak, or just the idea, I should say, that, and you can kind of go one of two ways, that there's so much universal waste going on. So, you know, if somebody hears that and maybe they say, well, I guess I can throw my trash out the window because it's all fakaked anyway. You know, the more nihilistic to the other end of the spectrum where I feel I'm a little more at, it's like, that just means that it's even more of a rare and beautiful thing that we're here, and we need to be even better stewards than we are, because if we want to even attempt to reach any of these resources or reach anything beyond our planet, then, you know, we have to start here. This is the best shot we have and we're ever going to have.
Yeah. No, I can't remember who said it, but I remember someone like reading something on Twitter where like someone was like, you know, there are either like two possibilities, either like the universe is completely meaningless, or like, you know, it has a meaning, and both are like equally terrifying.
Yeah. Which they can be, right? Sometimes it depends on the day, really, on your mood. Almost, it can change.
Yeah. Well, I'm not even like talking about like personal meaning. Like I'm like talking about like, you know, like the really crazy shit where like, you know, we delve even like deeper below string theory or whatever, and then it turns out that, you know, like there's like actual like meaning written into like the physics of the universe, which would be terrifying and amazing. But I won't speculate on that because I failed both of my math courses at university, so let's not.
Yeah, I'm nowhere near that level of sophistication. When I hear meaning in the universe, the only thing that pops up in my head is, you know, religious dogma and their claims to that kind of meaning. But that is a whole other whole other rabbit hole that we don't need to get down.
Yeah, well, no, anyway, on something slightly more tangible, I think what you were getting at is like sustainability and like general not fucking everything up here on Earth, and how that relates to transhumanism. And that's also another reason. That's also another thing that brought me in. I think one area I'm really excited about is like meat replacements.
Yeah.
I apologize to anyone out there who eats meat. I eat meat. I do it because the diet I'm on, I need to get fat in me, and I find chicken to be a reasonable middle ground, because beef is like really bad and chicken is not as bad, but it's still bad. But I think like meat alternatives, be it, you know, like the Impossible Burger or actual lab grown stuff, I think if we manage to like pull it off and we manage to get like widespread adoption by society, I think we'll look back on it basically as like a moral victory equivalent to like the abolition of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
That brings me on to something else. I think one really interesting thing that transhumanism does is I think it like sees that human intelligence, we only think it's special right now because we have nothing to compare it to. And so there's the possibility of I think it's animal uplifting, where the aim is to like bring animals the same intelligence as us. And there's like some people out there who like take this even a step further, and they're talking about like abolishing all suffering within like the ecosystem, which is completely insane. But it's like one of those really good insane things where, you know, your first reaction should be like, wait, what? And then it should be like, but, you know, if you could actually pull this off, like, just imagine how amazing that would be. I think transhumanism as like just a humanism that tries to extend the circle of what we consider to be like things that we should care about, like beyond just the human. And it shouldn't just be like a paternalistic arrangement where we're like, oh yeah, we have to care for these animals because they're too stupid to do it for themselves. But like, it's more of a proactive thing where we're like, yeah, we want to raise these animals, we want to give them the ability to make decisions the same as us. Yeah, so I think giving animals the same like intelligence as humans, I think is like a really interesting area of transhumanism, and I think I think giving them the ability to like self-determine as humans could potentially, although it's probably decades if not centuries away, that perspective of like we should be treating these things as if one day they would have the same cognitive capabilities as us. I think that is like a good perspective to have.
A lot of times we frame the transhumanist debate, or it's been framed, I should say, as I've heard it, from human to human. We don't think about the implications of somehow imbuing humanity to something else, to an animal or some other less than human object or sentient sapio kind of thing.
So I take issue with the word like human in that context. I think right now it's like a good placeholder, but I think really the only reason we use it is because humans are the only example we have of it, like intelligence right now. Right. So were we to see like other forms of intelligence arise, I think the notion of like an essential, like anything like that's like essentially human, I think would be lost. And that's not to say like there aren't things that are good that we should value, but I think we would start seeing them as just like attributes of things that have intelligence as opposed to things that are just uniquely human.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I suppose you're right. Calling it human is kind of the only language we have right now, but certainly we can imagine a future where it'd be either some amalgamation of a labels of some type to imbue something that has intelligence, that has consciousness, that has meta layers of awareness, kind of the things that make us uniquely human, as opposed to maybe our chimp ancestors or something like that.
Yes, and I think like again that like goes back to what I think the core of transhumanism is, which is wanting to expand this circle of what we currently call human, but I think would quickly become like intelligence, metacognition, or whatever.
For sure, yeah. And there's people who are more on the side of trying to preserve that humanity to some degree in its forms. I think there's always going to be that to some degree. There's always going to be folks, when we see it in our political discourse here in the States, with the Keep America Great again, like let's keep things, let's not tamper too much, let's not play with God too much, even though we've done it. We've been doing it since, like we stated at the top of this, since fire. Yeah,
and also like there's a hypocrisy there, like right now, like the current political system in the United States may seem like very like conservative. If you went back like 200 years ago, the current system they have would be seen as like radical and dangerous.
Yeah.
Like the most conservative Republican, some social issues, like they'd be seen as, like a radical liberal or something. So yeah, maybe the solution is just, don't give those people life extension.
Yeah. And that just brings up this big old ball of ethics. You hear the phrase often to be on the wrong side of history. And certainly our social evolution is going to make heads or tails of all that stuff. It already has in a lot of ways. That's why it's harder for me to understand to some degree the folks who always side on the preservation side of things. It's hard for me to take a non-nuanced stance, I guess, with these types of things.
And you were kind of alluding to this earlier when you were talking about like moving to like artificial selection versus like natural selection. I'm not 100% sure about this, but I'm confident enough that I'll say it and people can call me an idiot if I'm wrong. But I think there's like pretty good evidence for why like Darwinian evolution in terms of like a natural selection process is like sort of like built into nature, and you can probably like justify it mathematically, just because like a sufficiently complex environment, you can't really from scratch build something. And so you need like an iterative process to make progress within that area. Yeah, I think there is like certainly something to the notion that you shouldn't throw everything away and try and like rebuild it from scratch using like a simplistic set of principles to guide you. So yeah, I think there's something to that. It's, I just have like an issue when, people say like, oh, like this is the natural way. You use like medicine and, you like drive cars and like you use all this stuff that completely contradicts your supposed principles, which is like, I guess I have a little more respect for people who are like, no, we should just go back to being hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
Like they are, even if like,
purists.
that means like, yeah, like even if that means, potentially killing like however many billion humans, at least you're consistent in your logic as opposed to people who are really probably just more like afraid of having to update their principles in accordance with the new reality.
Yeah, somebody who doesn't want their current bubble to be invaded to some degree. Their social norms to change, their jobs to be the same, consistency, which, I think some of it, I have empathy for that. Some of that's out of a place of consistency and community, and certainly those are good things, but taken to a tribalistic place, it can kind of get you in trouble. But yeah, I think the beauty of transhumanism, so far as I've looked into it, is that it's a striving, it's like a kind of a philosophical and ethical and et cetera framework. It's trying to encompass all of the potential things we will run up against as these technologies become even more and more invasive. And to me, the biggest ethical quagmire I can see that we're in, and certainly countries like China are just now starting to experiment with like their social ranking system and things like that, is data rights. Do we have a claim to our likeness and our privacy, and how far does our government want to reach with that? Like here in the States, when the Edward Snowden stuff happened, that's when I got really concerned about this kind of stuff. It was such a huge expose that people kind of more or less shrugged off, and we're just sort of complicit and complacent. And it's not just the government, it's private entities too. So you have this dual-pronged thing. And right now it's benevolent to some degree. I mean, as far as we know, I mean, that's a whole other rabbit hole that can get us into some conspiracy. But how does it stay benevolent? How can we ensure that our data and our likeness, our privacy is going to stay ours?
All right. So there's like multiple layers to this question, which means I'll have to talk a lot.
No worries.
So most important one is most of the data monitoring that goes on in the West is being driven by companies basically looking to maximize advertiser revenue. And this is because the business model of corporations that exist on the internet, it's basically the way it played out with like the .com crash, late 90s, early 2000s. Basically, like the only way that you can actually make money is to advertise. And you want to get better at advertising, which means you want to know more about people. Therefore, you like try and scrape as much data as possible, and you create these really sophisticated algorithms to analyze stuff. And like that's basically how the economics of the internet works for all these like free platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, YouTube, whatever.
It's a classic saying of, if you're not being sold a product, then you are the product, etc.
Yeah. So the really interesting thing about that is even though we've got like like some of the like best, it's kind of depressing, but like some of like the best like computer science minds of like our generation are working basically on how to increase like Facebook ad revenue by like 1% per quarter or whatever. That's quickly running into diminishing returns, just because to make better inferences using algorithms, you need like ever increasing amounts of data and ever increasing amounts of computing power. And like you can't just, after a certain point, it just becomes very difficult to get data from people, and computing power obviously costs money. And so it was either like earlier this year or late last year, there was a piece about how Facebook basically lied about the amount of engagement it was getting from videos on its website. And like that was a big deal because all these news companies shifted to video because Facebook promised it was like really engaging and it wasn't. And so there were like just a bunch of stuff like that. And the upshot basically is like that model of financing internet companies, it cannot see like the same returns on growth that it did for the past however many years. And so eventually like it's like kind of going to hit a wall. Another dynamic that is probably going to diminish the ability of corporations to spy on us is that culturally we're becoming like so much more interconnected. One really good place you can see this is with like sort of culture online. It moves at this incredibly fast rate and it's like incredibly unpredictable. And you've got the jokes on Twitter, like in terms of complexity and references, you know, it makes like postmodernist literature like look, you know, like infantile by comparison. And so basically what's happening is like we're all fragmenting into like subcultures, and the speed at which discourse moves makes it like very difficult for like what advertisers previously wanted to do, which was like break people down into like categories and advertise to them. It's why we've seen like corporations trying to, you know, adopt like ironic social media personalities. And even then there's potential for diminishing returns there because like it only works because it's so new and novel. But then once everyone starts doing it, it gets old and boring. And I think like the degree to which, you know, as a society where in certain ways we're becoming like our levels of like meta and like self-reference and it's becoming so like complex that make attempts to monitor us from a top-down perspective, it hurts them. That's on like the advertising side. On like the government side, there's like still basic fundamental problems of that prevent AI from doing certain things that we still haven't solved, that we could solve potentially, but we haven't solved it yet, which limits their effectiveness. First of all, there's like the problem of just like computing all the data that comes in. So they may or may not be able to do that. But the second one is to like do something like the Chinese social credit system, you need to have like specifically defined behaviors that are bad and that are not bad. These are the problems that we've already like dealt with for, you know, hundreds or thousands of years in like the legal area, where like you can't create a legal system that can regulate every single behavior in existence because there's like an infinite amount of them, and you can only ever write like a finite amount of words in a book that dictates what you can and cannot do. And so like there's like potential for people to like step outside the system and try and game it. I haven't looked too much into like how people are doing that in China, but like I think people have already done that. Yeah, in like the United States, for like for systems of algorithmic control that aren't as all encompassing. Yeah, there's like weird mathematical reasons why like attempting to create like such a system, while it is certainly scary and we shouldn't like understate it, there are like limitations to it. But I think that's all like those are all like, you know, like technical questions about what we can and can't do with technology. I think the really interesting question is like, how should we move forward and what should our expectations around privacy be? I think just the sheer like economics of surveillance means that privacy outside of very specific contexts is like going to be basically dead. And I think the question then is, do we want a democratic form of surveillance where like everyone can see everything, or, you know, do we want it in the hands of an individual that we don't really have checks and balances for, or like we do have checks and balances for, but like, you know, we can't see what they're doing, and so we don't really have checks and balances. There was this science fiction author called David Brin who wrote this book called The Transparent Society, like in the late 90s, where he kind of saw all this coming. And he basically said like the choices are between like everyone can see everyone else, or like only a certain group of people can see everyone. I think like our current conception of privacy, I think it comes from the Industrial Revolution and like the modernizing that happened around then. I think prior to that, I think, our lives are a lot more open, for better or worse. I think that just the simple like facts of technology means that for a mature information age society, like just awareness of everything, that is like the most simple path, and like anything else will require like constant like pushing back against like what is just very easy to do, unfortunately.
Well, that's really an interesting perspective, and it's making me think maybe I'm being anachronistic about my approach to privacy. Because you're right, it could, I mean, well, the thing that you mentioned about a future where we could all see everything. I mean, I think we more or less right now have a very tepid version of that. I mean, you have these social media outlets, the government can see a lot, advertisers can see a lot, but none of them have the whole picture. But yeah, I can imagine certainly a future where our ideas on privacy have to socially shift, if not legislatively shift. But right now we're in this weird place of, we're kind of throwing our hands in the air and saying, well, we still enjoy these services, so we'll give you all this data, but we have no idea what kind of implications there's going to be for it other than helping train algorithms and AI to get better and better.
Well, one countervailing force might be that like, you'll be able to see everyone, but like your ability to like change your physical form will also like get to the point where like you can kind of go anonymous. Everyone will be able to see what you do, but like you'll have such freedom in like how you can express yourself that you'll have some degree of anonymity. That's like one countervailing force. The other one is in terms of like using the internet, there is like software like VPNs or whatever where you can like spoof your identity. I don't think it's like totally gonna vanish. I think in certain ways that were definitely not true before. I think like space will become a lot more legible, and the only question is like, do we want it to be legible to everyone, or do we just want it to be legible to a select few?
Yeah. And that's where a lot of these transhumanist arguments kind of come into play of having it be more democratizable, or is it more of an elitist thing? And certainly I think of things like a year or so ago in the States, we had the erosion of net neutrality, and slowly creeping in, we're seeing some fast lane-esque things happening. So people being priced out of certain tiers of internet and things like that. And the more these different companies kind of work together and make packages and deals and bundles that only, that you can kind of parse into, it's just, I don't know. It's a weird spot to be in, and it's weird to think how it'll keep translating. Really, the Wild West of the internet may be over. We're in the phase where we're quite hitting the industrial revolution of it. So you can have your prairie, but you can also hop on the train, so to speak. And the companies are really starting to clamp down further and further. I mean, we're seeing it in just our entertainment, our media, Disney Plus and all these different streaming services that are coming along. It makes me think of what you were saying earlier about how culture keeps fragmenting into these smaller and smaller spaces, and how there might be diminishing returns with the advertising side of this debate. I mean, I think you're right. I think memes definitely help. Memes are a way to be meta, to be, not only is it this beautiful artistic expression, and it's like immediate. I mean, there's something about, you see a good meme or something, or some post from Twitter, and it's just so perfect. It says something like that. It's like, oh, my finger was on that, but I could not express that thought. And I think people used to get those kind of epiphanies from books or literature or some kind of moving cinema, but now we're getting almost a daily feed of these things, for better or worse. Some people argue because we're only getting the platitude side of things, there's a lot lost, but that's another debate for another time.
Yeah. So I will say one thing about net neutrality. So the current internet infrastructure, it was the result of people deliberately choosing to lay down fiber optic cables. I don't know, back in the 90s. And one movement that's sort of risen up in response to that is this thing called mesh networking, which is basically you install software on your Wi-Fi router, and your Wi-Fi router will connect to all other Wi-Fi routers that are running the same software within its radius, and then it'll basically form, something akin to what the internet was originally supposed to be, which is, like all networked together. The idea of that is it's supposed to like bypass the official internet cables. There's like some projects.
You mean like the things that the ISP owns or their infrastructure?
Yeah. I think in America, like I think right now it's only happening at a municipality level. Yeah, which isn't that impressive. But I think in places like Spain and Greece, they've got ones that like cover major parts of the country. And, if you live within those areas, you just don't have to like go through an ISP. You've got this alternative.
I know in the States that we are fighting. I see from time to time news stories pop up about different cities trying to fight to keep or try to establish their municipalities' internet providing service, however that looks, because essentially you get Google and Comcast to come in and try to be the only game in town.
But like, what I'm trying to get at though is like, I think unlike previous like technological revolutions, I think one thing about like our current one is that some of the technologies are very like democratizable, and like you don't need to like have a majority to like fight back. You can like kind of do your own thing, and it's not going to be as like splashy as like what the other people can offer, but you trade away that for like responsiveness. And I think there's like some really interesting stuff that's going on there. One thing that I'm really interested in, although I haven't read much about it, is like kind of more decentralized social media platforms where you have control over the algorithms that give you content. Because like I use Twitter a lot and I really like it, but I'd like it even more if like I could choose what like I received. Right now I have very little control over that, and I think like there's a lot of discourse over like social media because it played such a big role in like politics over like the last couple of years, and like people are talking about like regulating it on a state level. I think an alternative vision to that would be like giving us the ability to control like what we see even more. And, of course, there are some people who would be like, yeah, but, then we're going to get even more extreme viewpoints. But I think I disagree. I think one reason why people are such dicks on social media is because you don't really have much choice in how you can engage with people. Like, you've got very simplistic like mute, block options. Like the mechanisms that you use to like send and receive messages it's very like primitive right now. And it's mostly like it was designed to, maximize engagement, not like maximize quality of the individual.
No, you're right. The tools are very primitive. I'm not even sure if you can italicize on some platforms, which is like, to me, it's a major, that would be even that step in people using that. I mean, not that anybody would actually use it.
Yeah. If you and your friends like are talking to each other and like, you're making an obvious joke, it's very hard for people outside your friendship group to like see that.
Yeah, and there's some things here and there I'll see like /s for sarcasm, little nomenclature like that. I mean, I wish that went a lot further, and maybe it will as we see more and more people engage. But I like this idea about us having control and choice over what we have shown to us. I think that would behoove not only us, even if it's a false sense or not, because of course these companies will, at the end of the day, still choose to show us what they show us. But right now, they're just web scraping and data scraping and trying to make heads and tails of what we may or may not want. And you get the ridiculous things like Amazon, suggesting that you buy one object that you buy, again, like, oh, you bought a vacuum cleaner, buy it again. Like, why would I need to buy? It seems it's so obvious to us, yet it still exists, and it's still something they haven't snuffed out that would be easy to snuff out. That would be a step in the right direction. I've also had similar thoughts about local government. So, for example, I would love to see a type of secure network where somebody could get on and verify in some way, I guess, and this is kind of separate from voter identification, which here in the States is a big issue because there's implications behind it of not being easy for people of certain minorities to be able to vote. But some type of verification, however it comes, that you're a voter, and you go into the system, and then there's this kind of easy to read, layman's terms budget, and you get to decide, you have so much money in taxes you pay, so I'm going to put this to this budget and this to this budget. And I think that would go a long way into a representative democracy that was actually each person would go. Of course, the other issue with that is not accessibility. So not everybody would be able to get on. Would it just be voters? All these other externalities, but it would still mean that we have more control than just pointing a finger and saying, I choose this person and I'll trust them, I guess, until I can't. And then
absolutely.
We have a quagmire of a process to get him out of office. So definitely control is in the purview. And I think it's really important to the transhumanist philosophies to include within it.
Let's talk about politics. So there's this really good article called Society is Too Complicated to Have a President, Complex Mathematics Suggest. It's a Vice article, and it's explaining this paper by this guy from, I think, the New England Complex Systems Institute. And it's basically a mathematical description of why overly centralized systems fail. And I suggest everyone go read it. But basically, the problem is it's one of feedback. Because like any decision you make, especially for an institution that's like as important and key as government, is going to have all these side effects. It's very, very difficult for simple, like mechanistic, like if A, then B sort of decision-making processes to be effective. People joke about how like Donald Trump, he came in with all these promises and then couldn't achieve them. But I think like one of the reasons that happened, and you also saw it with Obama, was just because like once a society reaches a certain threshold of complexity and you have all these people who are stakeholders and like they're all competing over this one central authority that has all this power, it's very, very difficult to make like decisions because, you obviously want checks and balances because you don't want like this central authority to get out of control. But on the other hand, like every single one of those checks and balances like increases the amount of time and the amount of resources it takes for like the institution to make any decisions or like get anything done. What you're talking about there is like sort of related. Well, no, what you're talking about is like a potential solution where like you look into like cutting out like the middleman who like makes decisions on your behalf. Maybe you replace it with like an algorithm that takes in inputs from people and then like will decide where money goes, or maybe you decide like maybe instead of like a government to handle these decisions, maybe what we do is we just like give citizens free money and then they can use that money to like come up with solutions on their own and that don't have to go through like the government to solve this problem. But basically the general thrust of like such arguments is like when you're in like a complex environment, you want like institutions that they take in like feedback from the environment like very quickly, and they can like iterate on decisions and iterate on potential solutions and maybe iterate even on like the institutions themselves for solving problems. So instead of having a single government institution that's supposed to solve a problem, you have like multiple institutions and they're all doing their different things. And then, institutions that are successful, like more people can go to them, or, like you've got some degree of like healthy competition as opposed to like centralizing everything, which creates like, problems with stakeholders. And it also creates problems with mistakes are magnified because it's either like, it's like all or nothing.
Right. Which is definitely what we're kind of at, I think, in our political discourse. It's the extremist. The pendulum keeps swinging just as hard as it can from one side to the next. And it's funny that, to me, there's a little irony here because I can imagine my co-host Kenny wasn't available, but he's more of the libertarian slant, and so that means making decisions and things for yourself and not being dependent on any type of government, and whatever type of government could exist would be a lot more direct, a lot more local, etc. I just say irony because right now we're allowed to just have these views, and because we are currently at the centralized spectrum of things, things can, to some degree, as long as they're working, be an autopilot, right? So someone like myself or yourself would be really all about these ideas and be involved. But I can just as easily imagine somebody like, oh my God, I got to get on this stupid system again, and I got to put in these things, otherwise I'm going to get a penalty, or otherwise I'm not going to do this or that. There's always going to be a kind of frozen democratic swath out there who's just like, just let me live my life and forget about this. And
well, I'm fairly libertarian myself, although I take it in a different direction. I'm not like I don't think like self-sufficiency is like good. I just think like libertarian arguments on like certain things are correct. I think like I think like centralized institutions in complex environments tend to fail, and they tend to fail like pretty spectacularly. But I'm also like in many other respects, I'm also very egalitarian.
But I think that's where a lot of people are, as far as having a dichotomy of beliefs on the political spectrum, which just makes all these things all the harder.
Yeah, well, that's why I was talking about stuff like mesh networking. I think if like we were having like steampunk transhumanism, and it was like you had to go through like big institutions. So one example, I guess, is like in like the 50s and 60s, where we saw like really tremendous scientific advancement. One way that happened was, we just had these massive institutions that would be like very like ordered and like very hierarchical, and then like within them you'd have like these crazy eccentrics that would be allowed to do their own thing, but that required all these other people following orders, and it was very rigid. So I think if it were in that case, then I think for what I want, I think I would have to bite that bullet, and I'd have to be like, you go into those institutions and it sucks in all these ways, but it's the only way we can get things done. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think technological super empowerment, I think individuals now, because of technology, like one individual or like a small group can do what used to take like hundreds or thousands. Like I remember like in one of my classes when I was at university, someone said, on my smartphone, like I have access to the same amount of information that just a couple of decades ago, like the only institutions that would have that information would be like governments and large corporations, and now everyone potentially has access to it. And I think like one area you can see that is with like the biohacking movement, which is just people with fairly inexpensive technology, and maybe it's on the scale of like $100,000, but it's at their local like hackerspace or whatever, and like they're playing around with biology, and like some of these people are even like self-experimenting and stuff. Yeah, how does this relate to people not being interested in democracy? I think a big part of it is I think people don't like, in terms of feedback, I think there's like an alienation there where like when I vote, like I don't really get any like feedback. I think if people like had more feedback from their civic engagement, I think they'd want to engage with it more. Right now, like just mathematically speaking, like if you vote in like a presidential election, like you do not have much of an impact. In fact, I have seen pretty convincing mathematical models saying like you should not vote. It is rational for you not to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And like obviously, like in saying that, I don't want to like disregard the fact that there's like voter suppression and shit. Like obviously,
just because it's not rational doesn't mean it's not important.
Yeah. Like like a safe state for either party. Like it is kind of rational just not to vote. In fact, it's probably like more rational go to like a swing state and like just do activism there than to actually vote.
Yeah,
but
and I'm in Florida, so that I'm definitely it's very rational for me to vote.
No, you should. Yeah, otherwise like the like swamp men will get power.
Right.
And, God, that'd be awful. In terms of like moving towards this future, I think like obviously politics is important, but I think also like doing it ourselves is also equally as important.
And one argument can be had that the frustration that we see now, frustration's a mild way to put it too, is because we have this system that is so anachronistic, and it's so counter to how almost everything else in our lives work. Our banks are automated. So many of our systems are either automated or so easy to use or frictionless, right? Now government is you can't think of a more friction-full example. Now, of course, that is somewhat by design. You have the 3 branches and the Ninth Circuit and all these other things. So that's good to a degree, but we're really to this point where a lot of the friction that's happening isn't because we need some time to think about and to weigh, the laws of the land. It's happening because there's an obstructionist mindset that's kind of taken hold, and no real progress of any kind is being made. And that's always been my argument to people in general, is like, I almost don't care who's in office as long as they're doing something that's not just tearing something down. That's kind of what I can't stand. Even if, of course, that obviously has its downsides too. You're getting the general zeitgeist moving in some direction. And to me, that's more important than just kind of sitting on your hands and saying, no, we need to go back to some other way of how it was.
Yeah. Like, and even just like practically speaking, like, like you're not going to be able to like both, I guess, like the left and right of like American electoral politics, like the visions they're presenting, like just don't make any sense. Like you're not going to be able to like you can do economic nationalism in like the age of globalism, but like it's really dumb for a whole bunch of reasons. Yeah. And also like it's also really difficult to try and pull off like a New Deal sort of thing, just because like of the realities of like automation, and also like 1930s, 1950s economic policy kind of required a world war for it to work.
Yeah.
It like really just doesn't make any. And the final thing is like technology in many ways like has the potential to like free us from work.
Yeah.
And what's her name? Like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like say what you want about her politics and like her opinions on things, but a couple months ago she was like, we should be taxing robots, and like robots coming to take our jobs is really good if like the benefits can be spread around to everyone. You can argue over like the implementation of that and like how ownership over robots would work, but like that sort of mindset is at the very least it is something new.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I never heard her. I've never heard that position. Yeah. But it's interesting to think about. Just somebody in our Congress that is actually thinking about. Yeah. Not even. I mean, I don't know if it was framed as legislation, but just putting forth the idea that, hey, technology is a part of this whole thing. We can no longer afford to keep it so separate.
Well, I mean, like that's again, like say what you want about him, but like that is like Andrew Yang's presidential campaign. I have issues with him, but like I can respect the fact that he's sort of like making this a central part of his thing, and he's like bringing the discussion to the table, and he's getting people talking.
Yeah, just introducing it into our democracy in some way is important, because I definitely can see the issue we have of the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos being the only kind of arbiters of where this stuff goes. They're multi-interested, so their focus will always be in other places. As far as I can see it right now, there should be more institutional kind of consistency in this regard. And I'm sure there is to some degree different offices that deal with technology, but the same way we have the completely, I don't want to say pointless. I mean, pointless in the sense that the TSA exists, and that's the only connection I make with them. But like the Department of Homeland Security here in the States, this thing that was created out of fear essentially and exists, as this entity of itself to make things secure. I mean, there should be some type of entity. I mean, I think of the EPA maybe is a better example. That's sole focus is on the issues of technology and its interconnection and things like that. Oh,
so you mean like a government organization that like is, I don't know, like it's like a futurist like risk assessment organization?
Yeah, maybe something like that. Yeah. And, and maybe it doesn't need to be in a whole organization. Maybe it could just be some part of a cabinet or something. But certainly more understanding of it, other than just saying, because basically the narrative we keep getting is like, yes, technology is here and it is very it is evolving things, and what do we do? It's more of a throwing our hands up instead of just breaching these subjects as they come. And, the hill I always die on, is, like I mentioned earlier, was the data privacy stuff. I mean, that's just one issue of many that could be focused on, instead of just saying, we've got to talk about it and what's our discourse. Well,
I don't know. I think a big part of it is just like, unfortunately, the United States, like the majority of like the people in your political institutions are just like really fucking old.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I saw somewhere like
is it that obvious? Is it showing?
Yeah. Like the average age is like somewhere around like, 70 or 60. You don't like, I think there's like only like a couple people who are actually scientists in your government, as well as engineers.
This is the part of the podcast where we shame America, and I just put my head down.
I will happily take part. No, so yeah, this gets actually to like the broader question of like how would a mature transhumanist society like organize itself? I think there are like broad visions of that. There's like sort of like the social democratic one. There's like, like libertarian one, which, is like really obvious. Like there's like more like anarchist ones. There's even fascist ones. I think unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on your perspective, but, I don't know, like if the state as an institution can survive transhumanism. I've seen arguments either way. But I don't think like a state like the United States can survive in terms of how it implements laws. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's, I think, if I was going to bet on like states that would still be around at the end of the 21st century, I'd bet on like countries that are really trying to innovate their governance, like not Thailand, Taiwan, I think is doing some really interesting things. Estonia is like a poster child. I think Iceland is doing some cool stuff. I think the sort of like crazy like seasteading, or like people who want to set up societies on like on like asteroid belt or like Mars, I would bet on like those being the ones that would survive, because the like liberal democratic form of governance was really in many ways like a product of the Industrial Revolution. It demanded like you needed certain mechanisms in society for like the economy to function, and that liberal like a liberal democracy was like the system on hand, and that's what we gravitated towards. Maybe some other systems would have worked, I don't know, but basically the complexity of the society demanded like multiple points of view. You couldn't just have like one king command everything. The fact that like weapons like guns and stuff meant that like smaller forces could potentially triumph against larger forces, which meant you had to include more people within the conversation. And then like the fact that you didn't just have these localized economies, like you had all these vast networks of trade and like moving resources from one place to another, that demanded also like representation, because if you didn't have that, then like entire regions could just like stop working, and then your entire civilization would come to a halt. And so obviously like the potential of transhumanism, like all these emerging technologies, like you can obviously see that they will also like force similar demands on our government. And I think there's like a lot of really interesting stuff to be said there, but it's also very complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And right now it's also very reactionary. We're just kind of we're just doing things that feel like band-aids. The most recent one I can think of here in the States is we had legislation over, I can't remember exactly how it was worded, but basically it was under the guise of, I think, child pornography, and basically as a result, it shut down all of these kind of prostitution websites, and Craigslist, for example, they no more classified. So and you have the externalities you have now. these sex workers essentially are back kind of in the streets and doing all these other, illegal on top of illegal things.
Yeah.
So,
that was like Sesta Foster, wasn't it?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. What happened there is like sex workers, they had like forums online where like they could like screen clients and, people could tip each other off over like whether someone was trustworthy or not. And then, they basically, they had like this like reputation economy basically that was very like this invaluable resource and probably like saved like countless lives. And then they legislated it out of existence accidentally. So like stuff like that. Yeah. And again, like that kind of goes to my point about how like complexity and, like a lack of feedback is really important.
And, we can imagine a future where sex workers become virtual, even more so than just like cam people. How far do you take that until it's prostitution by another means? And, you just kind of keep going and going from there. What about prostitution from cyborgs? We have a Westworld scenario where, is it okay because it's technically property of a company and it's not a real human, and all these interesting questions kind of pop up. But right now, we don't have anything near the mechanism, especially here in the States, to kind of deal with this stuff. Just groups trying to advocate for it to some degree, and getting their talking points in when they can, based on how much money their lobbies have, of course. But we're kind of winding down here a bit, and I want to take it from the large and kind of get a little personal here.
Sure.
I'm thinking about if you had somewhat of a transhumanistic or transhuman wish list, a bucket list of things you would love to either have happen to yourself or see in society. Maybe just one or two things you wouldn't mind sharing.
So one technology I'm really interested in is bodily implants that like basically act as like a sort of lab on a chip. I've seen some stuff, like some hints at this potentially becoming a thing, but I don't know how good they are. But like as someone who's dealt with a chronic illness, like a massive concern of mine was just the lack of information about what was going on in my body. And so if I had like an RPG readout of what was going on in my body at any one time, all the different levels of various chemicals and compounds, that'd be super useful. And also like I imagine that would be like revolutionary because developing countries and also like people in developed countries who don't have access to healthcare, like having a constant readout of what was going on in their body would be extremely useful. And then the other one, I honestly like new energy technologies. I think I think like kind of the human condition, I think really progresses insofar as like we unlock new sources of energy, and obviously like better solar panels would be amazing. And I think would really democratize energy alongside obvious environmental benefits. Fusion reactors and other like science fiction forms of energy would be amazing for space travel, and would also democratize space travel, which would be really awesome, and actually would probably suck a lot more than we think, because space is like a really crazy place. But that'd be super cool.
Nice. For your first thought about a more kind of biodynamic technology, all I can think of is what we have now. We have a watch that can maybe tell us our heart rate, try to kind of guesstimate different biorhythms to tell us what we may or may not have slept like. I'm not actually sure on that one. I don't have a smartwatch myself. And then we have the steps. Everyone loves to tout their steps or not. And I think I know what you're talking about. I definitely share that one on my bucket list. Something like that's way more comprehensive. It could tell you all sorts of things that are going on in your blood right now. Maybe somehow measure how much energy you might have left, or measure your circadian rhythms or stuff like that to kind of give you an idea.
And also like, you could see changes in your diet, or like supplements you were taking. You'd have like, cause like right now, like, my experience anyway, you start taking like a different supplement, it's like very difficult to tell what like effect it's had on you, because it's so subjective and it's very difficult to like compare one like mental state or physical state to another, because like you have no way of recording it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And, my mind easily jumps to a more dystopian idea of this. So imagine you had this device that was owned by Pfizer, and they said, well, why don't we just implant also with this device the type of medication this person needs? And then Pfizer has a say of, they'll read those bio inputs and dispense what medication they deem as necessary. Then the government has an involvement, maybe because you're on probation because of drug use, and all these type of kind of Black Mirror situations come about. But in the meantime, we'll have
it is very easy, as like you read any transhumanist stuff and then like you're like, oh, I could like, I'm gonna go become a writer for Black Mirror.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that is mined from this movement. Maybe that's why I'm so interested in it, because I love that show. But yeah, and as far as the energy stuff's concerned, I'm right there with you. Especially when it comes to space travel, I can't see a future where we don't have some kind of renewable energy source or replenishable energy source where we can sustain that long term. It's just a resource issue. And then, of course, that has implications, I think, for a universal basic income type of situation, where energy is easy to come by. So how much outputs do we need? So
maybe like the first universal basic income we'll see is like, it won't actually be universal basic income, but it'll be like a municipality or something will like just buy everyone in there like a solar panel or something. And then because solar panels are just constantly producing energy, like that energy can then become like, you can then like turn that energy into like whatever like your robots that you have around can do.
Yeah, this really leaves a lot for the imagination. That's one of the beautiful things about it. But it's important to connect that with kind of how we see it play out in the here and now. And yeah, as far as me, I guess right now I'm still kind of in the idyllic science fiction realm with things. My biggest thing on my wish list, and has been since I could remember, is uploading some part of your consciousness or even your memories to a cloud of some kind. Whichever one of those is going to come first, So I don't know why that intrigues me, just the idea. I've always been fascinated the moment I heard that Walt Disney froze his head, or any of these people cryogenically freeze themselves, and looked into plans like that, because it seems like you can just imagine this. You just wake up one day and you're surrounded by these proto-humans, and go from there. But I don't know. Maybe that's just my religious upbringing and trying to find a different way to live forever. I don't know.
Oh yeah, no. Yeah, no, please. There are like very a lot of people have pointed out like the Christian links to transhumanism. You should not feel embarrassed at all.
Well, awesome. Well, hey Frank, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and
yeah, no problem.
It's great to have you. Do you have anything you'd want anybody to check out? Anything you're working on? Anybody could find you at?
Yeah, no, I do like boring politics stuff that if you care about, follow me at mutual_aid. That's AYYDE on Twitter. And then what you should actually check out, because it's amazing, is there's this guy Ryan O'Shea who's a transhumanist who does a podcast called Future Grind. He gets like people who are like in the trenches with this sort of stuff. He gets like people who are like working on technology, or like philosophers who are like really figuring this stuff out. If you want to like get a sense of like what the people who are really serious about this sort of stuff are thinking about, you should check that out. Really recommend it. And then also I'll give a shout out to David Chapman, who's this guy who did like AI back in the like 80s and 90s, and then he dropped out. He's this guy who's like trying to like reinvent Buddhism, and also like basically this philosophy to deal with the problems of what people call like postmodernism or postmodernity. I didn't get a lot from him, but like his project, which is meaningness.com, has like if anyone was like, oh, like how do you think about things, like the way he like approaches like questions of ontology, which is like a really nerdy way of saying like what is in the world. His project is like where it's at, and if like you want to, you know, get involved, if you want to like understand like, you know, the more like nerdy philosophical stuff, that's what I'd recommend.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I'll go ahead and try to put some of that in the show notes so people can have some links to what you just mentioned. And I guess that's going to do it for this week at Things We Think About. All right, have a good one.
If you enjoyed the podcast, remember to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find more Things We Think About discussion on Reddit at r/thingswethinkabout. If you're interested in contributing to the show, our Patreon information is available in the description of the podcast, as well as on any of our YouTube videos.